Okay, thanks a lot, Giuseppe. So this is now the second day of our conference, and I'm glad this will be the conference of those who are stopping the fun for the technicians, the lawyers. So now it's our session. I would kindly and shortly introduce my panelists, starting ladies first, with Sara Bardelli, with a really technical background in an engineering corporation with 10 years of experience in that field. And I'm glad that you're here on the panel, that you can, let's say, tell us which we are coming, let's say, from universities, but maybe you can bring us back, let's say, to Earth. So now going to the sky, to my left, it's Udo Pagallo, professor of philosophy, and he told me, when I prepared here the short introduction, he told me that he's more living at Stanford, and he's sure that northern countries doesn't have anything to say in Europe, so it's only in the southern ones. And well, no, honestly and seriously now, he will present us, let's say, the philosophical and the allocation means and tools for liability and his perspective, let's say, a little bit American biased, I suppose.
In 5 minutes.
Yeah, in 5 minutes, Italian 5 minutes, and we will see what's happening. So, okay, and last but not least, to my right hand, an old friend of mine, Vittorio Zeno-Senkovic, who is also a very distinguished professor in software liability, and I always admired him for his broadness of investigation. He just handed me in 2 books, which apparently has nothing to do with each other. One about product liability, liability for cosmetics, ladies, and the other one concerning the mobile freedom regulation in the new media world, and he is about to produce another volume on transportation law, so he's covering a lot of areas which are closely related to each other. Well, and according to the panel order, I would suggest that this time we won't start with the ladies first, but that time, according to the panel order, with your speech. Please.
So good morning, my name is Sara Bardelli. Since my background is in a business administration, when Prof. Anna Masutti invited me at this conference, I asked to my mentor, Riccardo Rauber, to come to my rescue. And IDS, founded in 1980, is an international company with a subsidiary in Italy, UK, North America, and Brazil and Australia, with about 500 employees, and 320 of them are engineers. IDS and this is to change the...
Yeah.
Okay. IDS and Sistemi Dinamici, a joint venture with Augusta Westland, have developed Hero, a remotely piloted air system AirPass. Hero, a helicopter with 150 kilos at takeoff weight that will be operational in 2050, pending the results of the ongoing ENAC qualification process. As we will demonstrate, software and its use by the pilot are the major source of liability. Oops, pardon. Innovative technology in a remotely piloted system are related to positioning, navigation, communication. AirPass and a system that has to perform, as a minimum, to find its position with respect to a given reference system, navigate to get to the area of operation, sensing and avoiding obstacles, and gather data and imaging using the sensing equipment, communicate with the pilot at the ground control station. More than 18% of this technology are software-based. Hence, software liability is the major issue. Process followed by IDS for Hero. IDS has considered product liabilities and accident risk mitigation starting from the conceptual design phase, then continuing through its development, fabrication, testing, production and use. EDS was followed during each step by ENAC team that checked all the operations were consistent with the applicable regulation and to limit the risks. Environment and the human role in safe drone operation. When it comes to safe operation, surrounding environment and the human interaction are to be taken in account, such as unexpected bad weather condition and improper pilot reaction. The risk of pilot error can be mitigated by inadequate training. The simulation tool can improve pilot skills and their reaction to unforeseen situations that cannot be tested in a harsh real environment. Ideas and measures to limit the misuse of air repass. Human factor might impact the air pass manufacturer that has to clear itself in improving the human responsibility. To contain this risk, IDS provide a ground control station with embedded training function using simulation model. In addition, requests a stage of training for its RPAS user. IDS mission preparation tool enable the pilot to assess aircraft dynamics, sensors footprints, potential area of impact, and communication continuity with the GNSS signal and RPAS ground control station up and down the link. IDS action to limit airpass liabilities in non-segregated airspace. As said, redundancy in flight critical component design process checked by ENAC and throughout testing in segregated area will be ensure aircraft flyability. In addition, EDS has dedicated agreed attention to airpay mission safe preparation in the ground control station by enabling the pilot to investigate potential risks in all flight and landing phases. To be ready for drone operation in the civil airspace, IDS is already cooperating within CESAR AirPass demonstrating project in ENSURE program, validation and demonstration activities with the live trial, addressing the integration of AirPass in both non-segregated and segregated airspace. Liability and cyber attacks on drone. AirPass are de facto a cyber system connected throughout up and down a non-physical link. A cyber threat can jeopardize drone operation by interfering with the ground control station uplink command to the AirPass, stealing the upload data, hijacking the drone by capturing the uplink. Secure communication are an innovative field that we will deal with using physical and software means. Liability impact time to market and insurance fee. Industry have to sustain extra cost as the indispensable condition to get system operation qualification from avionics safety agency and they ensure safety in the sky. This extra cost is a social cost to ensure safe sky. Final user may be misguided when selecting their needed system on the basis of the prices only. Insurance fee could be a starting point when making decision about AirPass. And now, at least, something to ponder. Let me say, could the major cost that the industry has invested by adopting liability mitigation measures be compensated by a reduction of the insurance fee? At the end of the day, also the final user could benefit from a premium insurance fee when getting qualified products. What about regulating bodies such as ICAO and EASA, as well as insurance company increasing entry barrier enough to keep not compliant AirPass out of the market? Let me thank you, Prof. Anna Masutti, in this occasion, and all of you for your kind attention. I think that 5 minutes is enough. Just
Here we are. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Gerald. And let's see. That's going to be easy. Okay, 5 minutes, and so what I like to call a T-shirt presentation. Simple message, and to be compact in a few slides. And what I would like to stress is that we are dealing with a high speed transformational field. Since, consider that my last meeting on this topic, let's call it on RPAs, drones, whatever, was a year ago in Köln, in Germany. And a year ago, there were no Google drones. There were no DHL drones delivering drugs in northern Germany. So it would be a good Denken experiment to think about how about our field in a couple of years when this Alias project will be over. Is anybody able to imagine the new scenario in only the next 24 months? So let's start with a prophecy. This is Steve Jobs 34 years ago. Since one of the main topics is software liability, we are talking about something that didn't exist 60 years ago. And 34 years ago, Steve was imagining something that a few weeks ago turns out to be real. And so, first message, consider the speed of the transformation. Second point, consider what's going on today. Starting point. In a way, the state of today's technology suggests a matter of risk. We discussed about this yesterday, so let me skip this part of the story. In that, talking about RPAs and the like, could be comparable as traditional aviation and its risks were conceived in the 30s. Maybe when I finish this presentation, we can talk about the 40s because of the speed. So, in legal terms, of course, the standard legal approach is to conceive the general framework in terms of strict liability rules rather than negligence-related liability clauses, since, again, this part of the story has been told yesterday. Let's go on. Here, we have a sort of toy model talking about operators. Yesterday, it was stressed how difficult it could be to identify the operator. Before having lunch yesterday, you recall that I stressed another big issue here, data protection. So we have maybe thinking about operator and data controller, we be casting light on the proper direction. Talking about typical product liability of the manufacturer, well, let me stress that this point, product liability, should be stressed. Why? Because for a long time, at least in the US, I'm talking about the 80s, it was still a problem whether such informational products as a software should be considered a product or a service or whatever. In the end, there was a famous case with American Online about this. American Online lost because information was not considered a product. Nowadays, things most of the time change. That is, it's obvious producing software that is an operating system, that is a set of informational instructions for other informational objects. That's a product. But what's important here is that, let me give you an example about how things are rapidly changing. Think about Google. In a way, Google is helping us as lawyers. Why? Because this very distinction you can see between the operator, the manufacturer, designers, software engineers. In the case of Google, makes no sense. Because Google is the operator, of course, they have the software engineers, and they, for example, manufacture. Well, as you know, they bought last April Titan Aerospace from New Mexico. The Wall Street Journal didn't say how much Google spent for Titan Aerospace, but they bought it. So, as in a typical Hollywood movie, you have a vertical integration. From the first step, software, till let's make flight drones in Australia. This is a typical new scenario that 1 year ago, talking about this in Köln, didn't exist. Next step, we could represent, next slide, no, the back. A slightly different scenario that is thinking about the very difference, and so the problem of allocation of liability here. As you can see, for example, talking about software and design, you could have matters of negligence. Again, since I suppose Vincenzo will focus on this very topic, let me be very quick on this. In that, so far, I've been presenting matters of liability in a nutshell means if something goes wrong, who pays? And so the standard scenario is something is operating, an RPAs, whatever, something made it, someone designed it. Well, you can see this picture the other way around. That is, starting from the software vendor, and then imagine matters of liability the other way around, that is from right to left. And my personal experience in Silicon Valley is very tricky to show that a software vendor was negligent. Either for contractual reasons, they have tons of, by the way, when I had a meeting with Apple last April, the trick was that the terms of service of iTunes are longer than Shakespeare's Macbeth. Okay? I prefer to read Shakespeare, but in legal terms, it would be important to pay attention to iTunes terms of service. In a nutshell, that means that we are talking about warranty disclaimers, limitation of remedies, limitations of liability, integration clauses. So it's very difficult to, and in a way, it's so scary that so far in the US, when we have a huge software problem, not of course with Apple, Microsoft, guys like that, well, it's still tricky, but since I suppose that we'll be talking about this later, let me skip this part. But, next slide. Typical example in the US, okay, we have Houston, we have a problem of software. So first you have to prove, the plaintiff, that there was a defect through circumstantial evidence eliminating abnormal use. I recall the fact that there was a problem with an Apple software. I know what I'm talking about because one of the big guys in Cupertino is my sister. And, well, but they prove that the user was a smoker. He lost the case, just to give you how many subtleties we have here, not to talk about secondary causes and the like. What we could expect, or moreover, what we could wish? Well, in a way, I think, talking about software, we should pretend higher malpractice standards for professional liability purposes. Well, there is a European directive. I don't think that the content of this directive would allow us to solve most of our problems. But in a way, considering that it was made 8 years ago, that is a geological era in our 80 years ago, Facebook didn't exist, almost, just to give you the idea of the field about which we are talking about. And, or final goals such as the limitations of the Rome Convention. That is, for people in the business, this could represent, in the short term, something that will be worth to be talked about. In the medium term, that is when the alias projects will be over in a couple of years. I think that nobody has the slightest idea what will be the new scenario. I don't want to say in the long term, because in Keynes terms, in the long term, we are all dead. So my final slide is talking about this, neither software nor hardware, just beware. Thanks.
So now, Vincenzo, I'm sure that you're not see-ware, but we will see what you have to talk about.
Just a little point. Here you have iPhone 6 as the typical example in which, where's the software, where's the hardware? You don't know, and you won't go anywhere reasoning this way. Why? Because Steve, in 1980, thought about this already.
Thank you to the European Institute. Thanks to my dear friend Giovanni Sartor for this renewed invitation to this workshop. I too will start with, I don't have slides, sorry, with a quote, and I will start the quote. 3 devastating accidents have occurred. First, an air traffic controller, relying on his instruments, has directed 2 passenger jets onto an intersecting course. The jets have crashed and all aboard are killed. End of quote. Now this quote is not from some recent EU document, but the opening phrase of Susan Neekham's article, Liability for Malfunction of a Computer Program, published in the Rutgers Journal of Computer Technology and Law in 1 year before that Steve Jobs quotation, 1979. So this means that this topic has been on the table for the last 35 years, and the issue is always the same. How to avoid it in an unfortunate case of a mishap in civil aviation. There may be uncertainty as to establishment, allocation, and or apportionment of a liability. So the first issue I think that should be examined is that of the use of technological standards set by public or semi-public authorities, in the sense that you must use a certain software, and this software will be must be used by everybody. And according to the extensive Single European Skies regulations and the various bylaws, all the parties involved in the process, European Air Traffic Control Authority, airport traffic control bodies, airlines, will necessarily be using the same software which will conform to the above said standards. And clearly the malfunctioning of the software may depend on a multiplicity of factors and of entities, and often these entities are of public nature or vested with public functions. On the one side, we have typical problem of a defect in the development of the software. On the other hand, one should always remember, and it has been pointed out by the first presentation, that even if these systems are highly automated, they may be subject to human error, especially when certain data have to be inserted each time by a human and therefore are not automatically recorded. So in these cases, I think one should start from the bottom, because it is difficult to imagine a system of liability which is not coherent in all its structure. So I think one should look at the relevant provisions in the field of liability for air accidents, and therefore I would start, in my view, I would start from Regulation 2127 on liability for compensation to passengers for accidents in aviation accidents. And there we have a first principle of inescapable liability for damage to life and limb up to 100,000 special drawing rights, that is more or less 80,000 euros. May I just point out that in the subsequent, this is 1987, if we look at the recent regulation in the same field of protection of passengers, for example, in coaches, it's been brought up to 220,000 euros. So I think this is a limit which will be increased. But just to point out that this is inescapable. You have to pay. And above that sum, the airline may prove, and therefore we have the reverse of the burden of the proof, it must prove that he was not negligent or otherwise at fault. While general rules of liability apply to damage to things, that is the aircraft, other aircrafts, or buildings on the ground. So just to point out that, but if we are looking at the most serious damage to people, we see that there's a principle of unavoidable liability up to a certain point and no strict liability from there onwards. So I think that the question is that of trying to set the most efficient rule, and I think one has to consider four specific features in the aviation sector. First of all, the magnitude of potential damages which may be caused, which are generally huge. Yes, they might be small aircraft, but generally we're talking about mass disasters. Second aspect, and I can assure you this is something that comes from my personal experience having litigated a few of these cases, the great difficulty often to establish the causes, or rather the multiple concurring causes of the accident and offer a reasonable apportionment among them. It is really difficult to establish to what extent, whose fault. There are many faults. Many people were involved, many entities were involved, air traffic control, the pilot, the manufacturer of the airplane or of some device used in the airplane. Third aspect, that this is an area where all actors have third-party insurance. And then the last aspect, which is less legal, but it weighs very much, and you just have to look at the preambles of EU regulations in the field, that accidents which occur in the aviation sector are generally qualified as disasters, and when they occur, they do not only lower the trust in this means of transport, but raise considerable concern over the management of investigation, relief to the victims, and their relatives, generally their relatives, and transparency of the outcome. These are very sensitive political and social issues that have to be considered also from a legal point of view, from a policy point of view. So all this considered, the obvious solution appears to me that of a general compulsory insurance that covers all those who are, from the beginning to the end, are involved in the creation, production, and use of software for air traffic control. The efficiency of the system relies on the fact that the cost of the premium, whatever it is, can easily be transferred on the final users, that is, passengers and freight shippers, through minimum increases of fares and airport taxes. Therefore, just like in all consumer protection schemes, a strict liability regime brings about a mutualistic solution by which all buyers of a certain product or users of a certain service insure each other in the event of an accident. When I buy a Mercedes, obviously I'm paying a small amount of insurance in case Professor Spindler has a defective Mercedes and there's an accident. His car, not to him, but obviously the Mercedes. No, he bumps into one of those Korean cars, and there's a
take please an Italian car.
and so there's obviously a liability. So I'm paying insurance. All Mercedes buyers pay an insurance for damage which might be brought by a Mercedes car. An efficient insurance scheme not only does not weigh financially on the enterprises involved in the sense that it's just shifted downstream, but generally avoids public exposure of sensitive information through a trial. This, I think, is a very important issue which all actors in the process are very sensitive to. And the confidentiality need can easily be enhanced if the insurance policy, which should cover all the players of the expert system, contains an arbitration clause which should be able to solve internal disputes among the parties involved. So you bring it to arbitration, and this is solved mostly in a technical way, but obviously nobody, I think, likes to bring these to court. And I think the further element should be considered in favor of compulsory insurance based on strict liability is that when a significant number of air accidents happen, this is most common. I mean, we do find, yes, case Malaysia, airlines case are really out of the ordinary, but generally happen, we know statistics tell us that they generally happen during landing or takeoff, and that involves necessarily the air traffic control authorities, generally the local air traffic control authorities, and this brings highly publicized criminal proceedings, and in these proceedings it is inevitable that the correct functioning of the expert system will be questioned. Did the system work? Was the plane brought correctly on the runway? Was they told that there was an approaching aircraft coming, and so on? Typical aspects that we find in aircraft disasters. And so a strong insurance system is one of the ways of diffusing some of the most venomous controversies. And in several legal systems, I think of Italy, but not only in Italy, reparation paid to the victims is, from a legal point of view, mitigates the sentence. So this is a way also of reducing liability for the individuals involved in criminal proceedings. The importance that single European skies air traffic control will have in the near future requires also a constant update on its functioning and malfunctioning. In this perspective, I feel that it would be necessary at downstream of all this work we are doing here, and it will take some time. I think it should be necessary to revise Regulation 2010-996 on the investigation and prevention of aviation accidents in order to include the role that automated systems may have or have not played in the accidents. This requires full access to the investigator in charge. If you are familiar with the regulation, there's an investigator in charge to have access to the single European sky records with the aid of software experts, and one should amend as appropriate Article 11 of that regulation. I would like to point out that this regulation is very important because it clearly empowers the investigator in charge, says you do your judicial police and judicial investigation, but this is completely autonomous. It is not meant to set liability, but then, at least my experience is that the judicial authorities widely use the results of this investigation in the subsequent proceedings, whether civil or criminal proceedings. So this is very important because I feel that if the role of the investigator in charge in understanding if there has been some malfunctioning of the expert system would be an important role also for the industry, but also to solve the judicial issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and I would like to give the first round, let's say, for comments of my panelists concerning the other presentations. Sarah, if you would like to begin, if you have any comments on the other ones? No, nothing at all? No. Okay. So, Udo?
No, I prefer to give the floor to our colleagues and friends in order to open the debate.
Yeah, of course I would like to open the debate afterwards, but just, okay, if you skip that, okay, for Vincenzo, if you have any comments on the other presentation, nothing at all. Wow, 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 wow. This is such a coherent panel. So any comments on questions are of the colleagues here? Giuseppe.
Thank you for your presentations, very interesting. I have two questions in particular. One is related to open source software. I've been questioned by RPS producers of the small RPAS about the problem of liability related to open source software. The argument of the developer goes like, well, most of the time I release this software basically for free. It's not automatic, but most of the time, in practical terms, they release it for free for the community. Should I have the same burden of liability or not? And the same goes also for the user. What kind of liability I'm exposed to in case I'm using open source software? Do you see particular issues here in relation to other specific for open source software? The other question is related to the problem, to the fact that software in some ways is a sort of work in progress, in the sense that for internal reason intrinsic to the nature of the software, which is not always, which is almost always with errors in the code. So you have to update it, to patch it, or for external reason, like you have to update it as soon as you have to modify, for example, the process in which the software is deployed. Basically, there is possibly a problem of allocating responsibility between, for example, the user and the developer in case you have to update it. So, for example, the user has to report whenever he finds a problem in the use of software, and who has the responsibility to update it, something like that, if you see particular problems here in allocating liabilities.
Yes. I would really like to answer this question myself, but I'm not on the panel. So I leave it. I can. Oh, I may. I should. Wow. Okay, concerning open source software, this is really a big issue, let's say, for the open source community, and there's no way of talking out concerning liability for the open source software developer concerning third-party liability. We're not talking about the contractual liability. Even this kind of liability we have, well, at least at German law, even if it's individual contracted, you cannot contract out for intent, for intentional harms. For gross negligence, okay, we can discuss that, but only on an individual basis. Given general terms and conditions, even in the business-to-business market, yeah, well, at least in German law, you cannot avoid, let's say, the liability for gross negligence in general terms and conditions, and the GPL, for example, license as such as the other license as well, they are considered as general terms. Well, but please keep in mind, this is really, this is something which depends largely on the national law. We don't have a European harmonization concerning contractual clauses on liability in business to business. Yeah, we don't have that. And Germany is one of the hardest countries, a really hardliner here. UK, for example, it's much more liberal concerning that. But given third-party liability, you cannot contract out of it because you don't have any contractual relationship with the third party. So the open source software developer, if you get him, yeah, if you can identify him, he's liable. Second point, concerning open source once again, who is liability most? In most of the cases is the distributor of the open source software, because this is seen as a package, as a whole. So you're just selling, in brackets, the open source software, but it's combined with what you mentioned afterwards, patches, updates, yeah, all this kind of stuff, which is normally considered to be one contract, yeah, because each of the parts are depending on the other. So normally an open source vendor can be considered as somebody as importing the open source software. Well, and given the traditional patterns of product liability, he then is also be liable. Okay, this is the first answer, and the second one I'll leave now to the panelists.
Sorry, I don't want to sort of downgrade your question. When I started studying software, that was about 30 years ago, I thought liability, software liability was a great topic. After 30 years, at least, the cases are, in Europe, are practically inexistent. They're really not, there hasn't been much litigation, much problem. It is difficult to litigate. I speak from a practical lawyer's point of view, it is difficult to litigate software defect. So I don't think this is a significant issue. I would not consider open source. Here we're talking, let's bring it in this field, around this table. What I say, that the producer of this software, who is a producer who produces this software under a public mandate, he has received this mission, he must produce it for the whole system, the European system, and therefore he must abide by standards. That producer must be insured. And this insurance, that insures him, and then the subsequent downstream person who receives the software, let's say the European air traffic manager, he too is insured. The airlines are insured. Local airport traffic control are insured. All these have to be insured. Strict liability, that solves the problem. If we start quibbling about if there is a defect or not, we are never going to, I mean, obviously as a lawyer, I'm very happy. This brings a big case on my table. I make lots of money, but we're not getting anywhere. If we want a practical solution which is cost-reducing and efficient, is strict liability, compulsory insurance from the beginning, the producer, that line that Ugo Pagallo presented, that scheme that Ugo Pagallo prepared, and that's it. We can't start discussing niceties. We can, from an academic point of view, we do tens of books on this, but from a practical point of view, we don't want to go into this kind of issues.
Okay, I have now 3 interventions. Ugo first, then you, and then you. Okay.
Just to complete the picture, I want to say that even from the US perspective, since a lot of software here is American, and so open source makes not, you were insisting on torts, that is, what about third people damaged by the defect of that software. And even in the US, it doesn't change a lot in that you should pay attention to misrepresentation, typical situation in which I'm pretending that the software is such and so, and it's not. Negligence, which is really tricky because in a way it's linked to the very idea of professional standards, which are still highly debatable, especially in the open source. And at the end of the day, everybody knows that there is no software without bugs. That's for sure. But at the same time, from a practical level, it's not such a crucial issue, neither in the US.
Just think of the Millennium Bug. I mean, it was so much discussion, then nothing came out. Sorry, just to point out that we...
Thank you. I have a question from a more operational side. In ATM, but also in aviation, we are following what is called safety management system, overall rules, be it ICAO, EASA, European Commission rules, and so on. And this approach is actually looking at systems which, from a safety science point of view, are complicated systems. Well, we are now seeing that more and more complex systems, from a safety science point of view, do enter the field of aviation, be it an Airbus 380 or a 777, 787, you name them all. In air traffic management, we are not there yet, but we're getting slowly towards that. For any manufacturer or producer or regulator, what we do with the current setup, the legal setup, is we make a risk assessment. We say, we reduce the risk and all these things. Now, the events we start to see occurring, like the Qantas 34, which I would call a black swan event, or an evacuation of an ACC in Spain, where they moved into the training center. So are things which, with the classical risk reduction method, you can't simulate anymore. So from a legal point of view, maybe you can address that as well. We are creating systems. We don't know anymore how to evaluate the borders of these systems. And then the legal system will come back and say, but we had borders, and these borders are enshrined in law. What have you done? But basically, if you look, I'm taking the 380 example of Qantas 34, nobody was able to simulate the failure in any simulator in the world. So it doesn't exist, but it happened. So are we fit from a legal point of view? Or what are your views on these things where we are getting to an element where the designers, the users, the operators, the regulator are trying to do their best, but because the software or the hardware is so linked in between that you can't imagine anymore how it fails. There are other things like electricity, power plants, failures, and things like this, which I could mention. I just stay in aviation. So how do you see that from a legal point of view?
I would love to call that systemic risks, which we are familiar with in other branches. But I leave the floor to my colleagues.
You're right, but I will distinguish the technological field with which we are dealing or we want to focus on. Because, for example, the same scenario will materialize in the 50s, 60 years ago, with the first risk analysis for atomic plants. That is, they had no idea about the real risks, and this can be a very telling experience. Second, again, it's crucial to distinguish and pinpoint the specific technology with which we are dealing. Because, for example, another typical instance is given by robotic technology. That is, we have several problems, and very different depending on the robotic application we are talking about. And first option, precautionary principle. You stop reversing the burden of proof and saying, since you, manufacturer, designer, you don't prove it's safe, it's out of the market. First possibility, we have some examples of this in Europe. The risk is that that in many other parts of the world, they can be more flexible. And so, again, you lost competition, thinking about Europe. Second possibility is balancing the matters of risk, for example, with, according to certain safety standards, depending on the technological field, etc., in terms of insurance policies. It struck me always that there is no car insurance duty in New Hampshire. It's a policy option. That is, there are several ways in which we can address this set of problems, and I wouldn't generalize, since it's really context technological dependent. That is, give me the specific technological issue. For example, I think, and that's it, I think that in the specific case of our RPAs, first we have to distinguish the kind of RPA we are talking about. One thing is the jumbo drone thought by Zuckerberg in order to deliver internet connectivity for Facebook services. Is the typical Facebook's serious example on drone application. On the other hand, I have my students from the University of Turin, tiny little helicopter drones. So first, let's assume this field. Okay, let's distinguish several applications. And the overall conclusion is that here, my point is that I don't see so many risks, at least compared to the 50 scenarios of atomic plants. I think that when the ALIAS program is over, most of our issues will be political ones. That is, how about our expectation of privacy in a world crowded by little tiny drones developed by my students? I think your point is a serious one, but we have to distinguish the kind of a technological application, the specific field, the specific sub-applications, and in the case of RPAs, my personal opinion is that they are not so risky as atomic plants were in the 50s.
Okay, just a short comment from my side also. According to the current legal status, you're exempted from liability at least, because even under the regime of strict liability, we have an exemption clause concerning unforeseeable risks, which are really for nobody foreseeable. Then you're exempted even from strict liability. And I think, just to point out just one more point, which also goes to Vincenzo, I think one of the problems our neighboring law called criminal law, because there we got no insurance for that, and we have to look at negligence in the networks. And this is something what concerning my discussions with industry in Germany and as well as the European level is one concerns the managers more than all civil liability, because then you're getting personal at the neck by the prosecutor. There are rare cases for that, but even though it seems to be an issue for industry, I don't know exactly. Okay, so but I don't want to give the talk now. Who had been next? Let's follow the line. I had here, and then Giovanni and Vincenzo, okay?
Just to say that probably this is the question you put is probably would be best put to an insurance expert. I don't know if around the table there is someone expert in this field, but the problem is, it's a problem of statistics. We know that the European EU skies are the safest in the world, so I think it is reasonable to expect that under the use of automated air traffic control systems, there will not be a considerable increase in accidents. This would be obviously we would change, we would return to the old system. So what we do, we start looking at what is the rate of accidents in Europe per passengers, per miles flown, and so on. We see which are the accidents which are somehow related to air traffic management, because obviously if it is a defect in the airplane, that has nothing to do with this. Air traffic control has nothing to do with that. And so we start singling out on the basis of statistics which are the ones which have to do with only have to do with the aircraft failure and which have to do with air traffic control. And then we look at air traffic control and we start looking at what is the average each year, the average of damage brought both to passengers, to the aircraft, to buildings, to other aircrafts. And then we try to apportion to see what is the amount of, to what extent there is a risk in percentage that it could be related to a defect in the software which manages air traffic. I think that if you start, this is not my field, but if you start doing subdividing and going slowly, you get to a reasonable evaluation of the risk, and especially I think the important thing that more players there are, the more you can subdivide the risk, and therefore this means reducing the premium.
Just to comment what you're saying, I agree that, insurers were quite, scary when the Millennium discussions took place, and we, insisted on an exclusion clause. Nothing happened, yes. But my experience, looking on software defects and things like that, and the US system, products liability, each new technology to me has to be tested in front of a jury. And because of the jury system in US, where, say, the knowledge is not always in line with the ability that the manufacturer has, that creates could create some problems. So my question to you is, how do you see, will a jury understand the complexity and in the new software climate? Because we are also seeing that software, from my perspective again, is reducing cost. And reducing cost in front of a jury, to me, is something that juries always listen to.
As you know, there is a specific specialization of U.S. attorneys that is, their job is how to convince juries. That is, big offices with hundreds of professionals working over there, and some have this specific job, how to convince the juries. And so, in a way, most of the time, software problems of this kind, it's not a real issue most of the time. Since, again, there are some tough guys over there whose job is specifically, they know how to talk to a jury and so on and so forth.
Well, I would focus on a European system. We have no juries, and I think the main aim is to keep these things as much as one can out of court. As a matter of fact, I was, I didn't put it in my presentation. There were two aspects which I wanted to point out. One is if there are issues of class action, but I expect, when there's an accident, there's no problem of a class action. Those people were killed. They might be issues of forum shopping. This is what I would be interested in knowing, because obviously you could easily bring the case in your country in 28 European jurisdictions. But I don't think the jury is a problem. At least in Europe, it's not a problem. The US, it's their problem. Let them follow that. I'm not saying that, but it's there. It's there. Although, and I don't know if the software we are trying to establish in the EU is a software that will be sold in the US. But then that would mean move into the US, making a round table in the US, and we'll talk about a European software which is sold in the US and what are the liabilities in the US. In the European system, I think we should try and find a European solution which has, thank God, no juries.
Well, okay, if I may comment also on your question, and taking also into account the first one you mentioned, and what I would like to call, as I did, the systemic risk. And this is, let's say, the charm of the solution of Vincenzo, that we at least could have here insurance reinsurance, for example, who are establishing think tanks and bringing together the information which is now allocated, let's say, at each part of the whole chain. And this is what I realized during my whole life as an IT lawyer, that the left hand is not knowing what the right hand is doing. The interaction, for example, between different software elements, codes, etc., is one of the most dangerous parts, let's say, of developing software. To overcome this informational problem of interacting, you have to establish trust between the partners, because one software developer is not being disposed to disclose, for example, software exploits, problems of his software, to another one who is using that, who is developing that, who is patching that, and so on and so on. You don't have this kind of trust. And for that reason, it's absolutely essential to bring this information together, and insurance and reinsurance might be one way, because the reinsurers across the globe they do have these kind of think tanks. They do develop risk management system, risk assessments. But what I am wondering, when we, for example, we had been commissioned by the German Ministry of Home Affairs in 2006 to develop a new law for IT security and IT liability, also encompassing software, hardware, etc. And we discussed it with the German industry, the German associations of insurers. They had shown no interest at all. please keep us out of that business. That was their simple message. They didn't get into these discussions. They left out deliberately. Yeah? And it's the same today. We are now passing a new law in Germany concerning the so-called critical IT infrastructures, which envisaged banks, for example, railways, etc., maybe also the whole air industry. I don't know exactly. But once again, no compulsory insurance, and the Association of Insurances said, please keep us out. I don't know exactly why. I just passing off this information to you, perhaps for further discussion. So now, Giovanni, Giovanni, do we have some more minutes to discuss, or because it's 10:30? We do. Okay, Giovanni.
So now I have some quick comment on the open source. I think the alternative would be to see an open source piece of information to be used by the further users of this snippet of a program, and then so that the liability of the provider of this information is restricted according to the general issues of liability for providing an information input to further processes. But what I would like to focus is on the issue of, which was raised mainly by Vincenzo, dealing with product liability, which is not exactly a strict liability. I think an important issue is the so-called state-of-the-art defense. So, as I say, I'm not an expert on that, but I think that in product liability, it is not sufficient that there is that the product caused a damage. The product must also somehow be below the state of the art, which raises an interesting issue in connection also with software for aviation. We had discussed yesterday an important case concerning TCAS, TCAS2, which is a collision avoidance system. And there was, obviously there was an accident, and had the system been different, the accident would not have happened. But still, the system arguably was state of the art. So you have to wonder, and you have to wonder also for future systems. Assume that you have a system which generally improves security. But in certain particular cases, had the software been different, some accidents would have been avoided and other accidents would have happened. Now, if the providers of these systems have an unlimited liability with regard to accidents, while not being able to have the benefits that results from the prevention of accidents that didn't happen, maybe such a system will not be developed. And here we have also another issue which I think is interesting. As Vincenzo said, in the case of as things are now, there is a cap from strict liability, and then there may be, when the accident is caused by human error, there would be an increased negligence, an increased liability according to vicarious liability for the operator. And then there may be possibly the liability also of the pilot, of the person doing the. But if there is no negligence, then beyond the cap, the victim is going to suffer the damage. If you substitute humans with machines, then the producer of the machine will be liable, even in circumstances when there would be no liability had a human being operating. Which, again, you may wonder whether it is okay to have this kind of inequality, or whether this is an obstacle to increase security through automation. Because obviously, if you develop this software, then and you install it, then no, there is an increased burden. So it may be convenient not to have it and to shift the damage to the victim, as it is happening now. So this is the kind of issue that I would like to submit to your view.
Very brief comment. In my experience, in all European jurisdictions, which, with the notable exception of the UK, we'll put that aside, the rule is, from a legally realistic approach, is very simple. The greater the damage, the lower the limit of negligence. If we have a car accident, certain rules will be applied. If we have an aviation accident with 150 to 100 people dead, you are not going to find one judge from Finland to Malta, from Portugal to Bulgaria. You will not find one judge which will release from liability the industry, the defendants. The defendants will always be found guilty and they will have to pay damages. Because when we have 100 people dead, you have 100 coffins on one side and some lawyer who saying state of art, we are not at fault, it was some external cause and so on. The judge, whatever judge, in my experience, looking at tort law in whatever field, the judge will totally disregard these pettifoggish arguments and will go to the substantive point. There are victims, victims have to be compensated. So even if we do not write in golden letters that there is strict liability, the judges will de facto bring in some kind of strict liability. So if we know this is the ordinary outcome, I say let's be prepared. Let's prepare, have our insurance parachute ready. I think this is, I'm sorry if this is not a very legal, very academic legal approach, but it is a more practical from a practicing lawyer's point of view. But I think that I quite agree that state of art, just try and apply state of art in medical malpractice, has no success, no success. There's the dead person, the doctor says I do a state of art, and the judge will say, oh no, but he's dead, you will pay for him. And from an academic point of view, I resent this. I'm not in agreement with that. I've written against that, but I know that that is the natural outcome of a case of a patient against a doctor. So here we have not one person dead, but 100, 200, 300 people dead. And I think it is not a game that is worth playing. There's very few chances to win that game, at least if we have victims against operators. Within the operators, we can start discussing on apportionment.
Just a question following what you just said. If we change operators with controllers or pilots, do you think that the reasoning is the same? That given the fact that there is a victim, if the operator is not found responsible for whatever reason, the judges will find some strict responsibility or liability for the front users, and that without prejudice to the complexity of the system and all other factors which might impair them to operate correctly.
In my experience, the plaintiff's lawyers go and look for the deep pocket defendant. And if they don't find it in the private sector, they will find it in the public sector. They will say it is the public body that should have controlled the software and so on. So this is how it works. I mean, if you are a lawyer, you're not going to bring a case against a firm that has no money or a single individual, the pilot. You're going to bring it against the person who has the money. So this is the first aspect that has to be considered. So who has the deep pocket? So what does this mean? That especially who has a deep pocket, and those who have risk better, who might be brought into a case, even if from a practical point of view their role has been limited, they have given a limited contribution to the development of the software, they will be involved, and the judge, I don't think the judge will do a very significant, sometimes he might do apportionment and say, well, 10% here, 10% there, 50% there, but generally speaking, the judge will say it is, they're all liable on the same basis, and therefore they all have to pay for everything.
So the deep pocket operator, even though it has a limited role in the accident, that is the industry that should protect itself more.
Okay, I completely agree with what Vincenzo said. This is what is practice telling us, the deep pocket doctrine. But nevertheless, the story, sorry Vincenzo, I think it's a little bit more complicated, because then the deep pocket operator will try to pass on the damages inside the chain, even if you have arbitration clauses, and I have acted several times as an arbitrator in these cases, and then you have to establish some sort of standards for negligence, etc., inside the chain, because the deep pocket operator doesn't want to pay all the damages himself, even if he has an insurance, and even then the insurance will try to reclaim these damages, let's say, to software producers, etc., etc. So it is just being passed, the problem, into the chain. If we're talking about joint liability, and this worries me still because, well, according to my practice in arbitration, it was always a question of burden of proof. Who has to prove what? And well, then you have the clashes of cultures between technicians on one side, sorry to say so for the technicians, concerning technical standards, because they believe if you adhere and if you comply to technical standards, then the world is okay. But this is not the case for civil lawyers, because we tell you that you have to look at the absolute state of art and technology in the field, which maybe for airline industry is well understood, but it's not for software, because there you're lacking some technical standards in software. We have rarely technical standards for software. Okay, sorry for this larger comment as a moderator, please excuse me. We have one last intervention, and then I will give a last round to the panelists to give any final comments, and then we'll have the coffee break.
Yes, Filippo Tomasello from EASA. Just a news for you. I have a deep pocket to pay damages, and this is
Please
not
open it.
only because of the magistrates or the court, but the legislator in Article 31 of the EASA Basic Regulation 216/2008, in its paragraph 3, explicitly spoke about non-contractual liability of the European Aviation Safety Agency if the oversight or the rules were not proper. Of course, the lawyers of the insurance have to demonstrate and channel, but the will of the legislator is that even EASA could be considered liable, which is a good news for you. The bad news for you is that the big pocket of the community is fueled by your tax, but okay, that's normal.
Very shortly, just to, I don't want to open up another huge topic, but just for the sake of completeness, if any. Since I'm reading legal and social impact of automated systems in aviation, twice, Gerald, you stress a crucial point that we couldn't deepen, but which I think is fundamental. That is, talking about software liability, or in general terms, civil law, as opposed to criminal law liability. And, there is the huge issue of cybersecurity. That is the general framework in which, in a nutshell, talking about RPAs, it was a military kind of research, which only in the last years has turned out to be a successful civilian story. But we don't have to forget the military side of this story, within which, from a certain point of view, we have to consider certain civilian aspects. That is, talking about liability, who pays, we don't have to forget the social impact, because strictly speaking, it's obvious that cybersecurity is the new military domain of sovereign states.
Okay, now a last round of comments, and I assume, Ugo, that was already a final comment? right? Okay. Sarah? Nothing? Oh, come on. Okay, so Vincenzo.
Just, I think Gerald Pinder put a very important point which should brings us ahead in the discussion. I think we should try to distinguish the issue of liability towards passengers, towards third parties, which follows certain rules, and the apportionment of liability among the various actors. So we should imagine, while in the first field, I think the most obvious way is that of strict liability and insurance. In the second aspect, among the various actors, one should try to imagine an effective and not too time-consuming and not too expensive procedure to, once there is a decision has been made saying that there has been an accident, that that accident involves also software, then how do we, out of court, I would imagine the best thing is to bring this out of court and to find some kind of technical room, table where the various parties can sit down and try to find out. Obviously, if they do not agree, or their insurers, if they do not agree, they will go to court. But I think we should divide these two aspects. The main issue, compensation to victims, and then the subsequent phase, that of dividing responsibility and establishing responsibility among the various actors, and then having the various insurances of each actor pay their share. I think this could be one first step in dividing and trying to solve the problems in a more practical way.
Okay, thanks a lot to you all and to the panelists especially, and now I close the session. Many thanks to all of you.